The state of California built a prison so extreme that even other prisoners feared being sent there. No windows, no sunlight, no phone calls. Just a concrete cell, roughly the size of a parking space, and 22.5 hours of complete isolation. Every single day. They called it Pelican Bay State Prison. But the men inside had another name for it: Skeleton Bay. Most people hear solitary confinement and they think punishment. These men are being controlled. These men are being stopped. What if I told you they were wrong? Because inside those concrete cells, behind those locked doors, away from every courtroom and every camera, 6 men were not just surviving their sentences. They were running criminal empires. One of them controlled an entire city. Why these 6 men, sworn enemies who had spent years ordering each other's deaths, quietly joined forces in a move that shook the entire American prison system. Before we get into today's story, we want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching this right now? Drop your location and local time in the comments below. We have viewers tuning in from every corner of the globe, and every time we ask, the response never fails to amaze us. Pelican Bay State Prison sits at the very edge of Northern California, just miles from the Oregon border. It was not built to rehabilitate. It was not built to reform. It was built with one single purpose: to contain the men that every other prison in America had already failed to control. When it opened in 1989, it introduced something that California had never seen before: a security housing unit, the SHU. Inside the SHU, inmates lived in a concrete cell with a concrete bed, a concrete desk, and a concrete stool. A small frosted window let in a faint trace of light, but no view of the edge 3 times a week. Visits were conducted through thick glass, with no physical contact. There were no phone calls, there was no programming, there was no work. 22.5 hours a day, alone, in a box. Not for a month, not for a year. For some men, for decades. The state justified it simply. These were the most dangerous, most influential gang leaders in the California prison system. Validated members of criminal organizations so powerful that their presence in general population was considered a direct threat to the safety of staff and inmates alike. The only answer, the state argued, was permanent separation. What the state did not fully reckon with was that isolation does not dissolve power, it concentrates it. Because the men sent to Pelican Bay's SHU were not foot soldiers. They were not low-level criminals who would quietly fade into the concrete. They were the architects, the decision-makers, the men whose word, even from inside a box, carried the weight of law on the streets of California. And the streets were still listening. Todd Ashker did not arrive at Pelican Bay as a legend. He arrived as a problem. Born outside Denver, Colorado, Ashker spent his teenage years cycling in and out of juvenile facilities for a string of minor offenses. By the time he was 18 years old, he was already inside California's adult prison system, convicted of burglary. A small crime, a short sentence, the kind of start that, in another life, might have been a wake-up call. While serving time at Folsom State Prison, Todd Ashker stabbed another inmate to death. The killing was calculated and deliberate. A mattress was held up against the door of the cell to block the guard's view, while Ashker carried out the attack. Prosecutors argued it was a sanctioned hit, ordered by the Aryan Brotherhood, one of the most ruthless white supremacist prison gangs in the United States. Ashker maintained it was self-defense. In 1990, Ashker was transferred to the newly opened Pelican Bay State Prison and placed directly into the security housing unit. When he arrived, he won inmates the right to order books. He won the right for prisoners to collect interest on their prison savings accounts. He challenged conditions, policies, and procedures, methodically, persistently, and effectively. But the most important fight was still ahead of him. And it would not be fought alone, because Todd Ashker was not the only powerful man in that prison. And the day would come when the most unlikely group of allies in American criminal history would find each other inside the very walls that were built to keep them silent. If Todd Ashker represented the calculated, methodical side of Pelican Bay's most dangerous inmates, Arturo Castellanos represented something else entirely: raw, organizational power. Castellanos was convicted of murder in Los Angeles County in 1979 and sentenced to 26 years to life. He was young, he was violent, and he was already deeply embedded in one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the United States, the Mexican Mafia. Inside the prison system, Castellanos did not slow down. His disciplinary record told the story clearly: 6 stabbings, multiple drug violations. Violence was not something Castellanos stumbled into. It was a tool he used deliberately and without hesitation. By 1990, the California Department of Corrections had seen enough. He was validated as a Mexican Mafia member and transferred to Pelican Bay's security housing unit. And that is where most people assumed his story would end. It didn't. From inside his SHU cell, Castellanos maintained his position as the undisputed leader of Florencia 13, one of the largest, oldest, and most powerful street gangs in Southern California. His instructions traveled the way all instructions traveled out of Pelican Bay, on a kite, a small scrap of paper, covered in tiny handwritten script, smuggled out of the prison, recopied, and passed down through a chain of intermediaries until it reached the streets of Los Angeles. In 2004, one of those kites carried an order that would result in more than 20 deaths. Castellanos allegedly directed Florencia 13 to begin a systematic campaign to remove black gang members, specifically the East Coast Crips, from the Florence-Firestone neighborhood of South Los Angeles. The killings that followed were not spontaneous. They were organized, they were targeted, and they were ordered from a concrete cell in Northern California by a man who had not walked free streets in decades. The federal investigation that followed resulted in one of the largest gang indictments in American history, 104 suspects charged, but not Arturo Castellanos. Federal prosecutors made a decision that speaks louder than any indictment. They concluded it was safer for everyone to leave Castellanos exactly where he was. To bring him out as Pelican Bay for court hearings, they reasoned, was to give him access. Access to people, access to networks, access to influence. It was important that Castellanos not be let out, a prosecutor said, because he holds sway over gang members to do things they would otherwise not want to do. Think about that for a moment. The United States government looked at a man sitting alone in a concrete cell and decided that cell was the safest place for him to be. Danny Roman had been inside California's prison system since 1985. Convicted of first-degree murder, sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. By every measure of the justice system, he was finished, contained, neutralized. But the justice system had underestimated Danny Roman. From inside Pelican Bay, Roman built and maintained control over the Harpies, a Latino street gang in South Los Angeles, extended his reach across more than a dozen other gangs in the surrounding area. He was a validated member of the Mexican Mafia, and his word carried absolute authority on the streets of South LA. The operation he ran was not disorganized. It was structured, layered, and deliberate. Roman passed his orders through the people closest to him. His own daughter and her husband became the primary conduits between the prison and the street. Family, in Roman's world, was not separate from the criminal enterprise. Family was the criminal enterprise. The crimes conducted under his direction were wide-ranging. Rival gang members and Mexican Mafia members were targeted for murder. Businesses were extorted. forced to pay tribute that was funneled directly back into Roman's prison account. Gang members robbed students near the University of Southern California. Every dollar generated on those streets had a path that led back to a man sitting in a cell hundreds of miles away. And then, the operation unraveled. Federal investigators dismantled the network piece by piece. Roman was charged, prosecuted, and the full scope of what he had built from inside prison was laid out in open court. But Danny Roman's story did not end in a courtroom. It ended on the floor of the substance abuse treatment facility and state prison in Corcoran, California. Roman was 64 years old when two fellow inmates attacked him. He was stabbed multiple times, in the face, in the body. He was pronounced dead within minutes. A retired prison gang investigator assessed the killing with a single, measured observation. If this was a sanctioned Mexican Mafia hit, he said, then Roman had been judged and sentenced by the very organization he had served his entire life. And if it was not sanctioned, then the retaliation for killing one of their own would be severe. Either way, the streets were still keeping score. Michael Torres was born in 1964. He was 18 years old when he first entered California's prison system, convicted of voluntary manslaughter. A teenager, already headed in one direction. He served 16 years. When Torres was released, he did not walk away from the life. He walked deeper into it, because while he had been inside, something significant had happened. Torres had been sponsored for membership into the Mexican Mafia by one of the organization's own founders, Luis "Güero Buff" Flores. That sponsorship happened inside Pelican Bay State Prison in 1994. And it changed everything about who Michael Torres was and what he was now authorized to do. He became the Mexican Mafia's designated tax collector for the entire San Fernando Valley. Every gang operating in the valley paid him. Every criminal enterprise generating income in that territory owed Torres a cut. His reach was described plainly by a witness who testified against him. "Mosca's got the whole valley," the witness said. "Every neighborhood pretty much pays him. The money was real, the authority was real, and the violence used to enforce both was equally real." In 2003, Torres knocked on the door of an apartment in North Hills and shot a man who had been falsely claiming membership in the Mexican Mafia. Claiming false membership was not a minor offense in that world. It was a direct challenge to the organization's authority, and Torres handled it personally. He also ordered the kidnapping and near murder of a witness. When investigators eventually arrested him, they found bundles of cash hidden in a crawl space and an additional $6,000 stuffed inside a coffee pot. Torres was convicted and sentenced to 133 years to life for attempted murder, conspiracy, weapons offenses, and witness tampering. He would never be free again. On July 6, 2023, Michael Torres was stabbed to death at California State Prison, Sacramento. Another Mexican Mafia figure killed inside the system that had shaped him, sponsored him, and ultimately consumed him. The valley he once controlled never knew the moment he was gone. 26 years. That is how long Michael Lerma spent in solitary confinement at Pelican Bay State Prison. 26 consecutive years inside a concrete cell, cut off from the general population, cut off from the outside world, cut off from everything. And it changed nothing. Lerma, known on the streets of Pomona as Pomona Mike and Big Mike, was a validated member of the Mexican Mafia. He had been sent to the SHU because the state considered him too dangerous, too influential, and too connected to exist anywhere else. The logic was sound. If a man cannot communicate, he cannot command. If he cannot command, he cannot cause harm. The logic was wrong. With Lerma locked inside Pelican Bay, completely incommunicado, the task of collecting taxes from Pomona's street gangs fell to a carefully organized network of associates on the outside. Female associates, operating at the top level of his organization, collected proceeds from drug trafficking, robberies, kidnappings, identity theft, and fraud, and deposited the money directly into Lerma's prison account. The operation ran with quiet consistency for years. Nobody on the outside stopped paying. Nobody stopped following instructions, because the instructions never stopped coming. And then Lerma was transferred to a federal detention facility in Los Angeles. Within the walls of that facility, he immediately took control of the internal drug trade. The markups were extraordinary. A gram of methamphetamine that cost $20 on the street sold for $250 inside. A $25 gram of heroin cost $200 behind those walls. Inmates who could not cover their debts were stabbed. In March 2025, Michael Lerma, 69 years old, was sentenced to life in prison for murder and racketeering. The murder had been ordered as direct retaliation for an inmate's failure to pay off a heroin debt to the gang. 26 years of solitary confinement, a transfer to federal custody, and still, at 69 years old, a life sentence for murder. Some men, it turns out, cannot be contained by concrete alone. In 2001, the 5 highest-ranking commanders of Nuestra Familia, one of the most powerful and organized prison gangs in California history, were transferred out of the state system and into a maximum security federal prison in Colorado. The state believed this would cripple the organization. Remove the leadership, and the structure collapses. It was a reasonable assumption. It was also incorrect. What followed inside California's prisons was not collapse. It was a power struggle. With no commanders left in Pelican Bay, generals began competing for position, for authority, for control. The organization that had operated under clear, defined leadership for decades suddenly had no single voice. And into that vacuum, one man stepped forward. David Cervantes. Through years of internal consolidation, Cervantes emerged as the sole commanding leader of all Nuestra Familia operations across California. It was the first time in decades that the organization had been unified under a single commander, and Cervantes used that position with full awareness of what it meant. From inside Pelican Bay, he directed a criminal enterprise that operated simultaneously on 2 fronts, inside California's prisons and on the streets of its cities. The tool that made it possible was simple: a smuggled cell phone, sometimes passed through lawyers, sometimes through family members, but always finding its way into Cervantes' hands. With that phone, he received intelligence, he issued orders, he authorized murders, directed drug trafficking operations, and oversaw money laundering across the state. California Attorney General Jerry Brown described the reach of the organization in direct terms. Nuestra Familia, he said, does not only call shots in prisons, it calls shots in the neighborhoods of California. The federal case against Cervantes and his co-defendants took 3 months to try. The evidence was extensive. A long-running criminal enterprise built on murder conspiracies, attempted murders, drug trafficking, and money laundering, conducted from inside the walls of the most isolated prison in America. In 2024, the jury returned its verdict: guilty. David Cervantes was sentenced to 120 months in federal prison, the last general of Nuestra Familia, brought down not by a rival, but by the weight of his own commands. In 2006, prison officials at Pelican Bay made a decision that, on paper, made complete sense. They took every inmate they considered the most influential, the most connected, and the most dangerous in the entire SHU, and they moved them into one small, concentrated section of the facility. A section that would come to be known simply as the short corridor. The reasoning was straightforward: centralize the most powerful men, increase surveillance, tighten control. If you can see them all at once, the thinking went, you can manage them all at once. What prison officials did not fully account for was this: they had just placed the sworn leaders of 4 of the most violent rival gangs in American history into physical proximity with one another for the first time. The Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, the Black Guerrilla Family. Organizations that had spent decades ordering each other's deaths. Gangs whose members had killed and been killed in conflicts stretching back generations. Men who, under any other circumstance, would never have been in the same room, let alone the same corridor. And yet, something unexpected happened. They talked, not loudly, not openly, but through the careful, patient channels that men in solitary confinement learn to use. Written notes, shared legal documents, quiet words passed through the narrow margins of daily prison life. The leaders of these four organizations began to communicate, and what grew out of those communications was not more violence. It was strategy. Together, they formed what became known as the Short Corridor Collective. Enemies by history, by affiliation, by every rule of the world they had come from, but united by one shared reality. They were all being held in indefinite solitary confinement, with no clear path out, under a system that offered no transparency and no accountability. On July 8, 2013, the Short Corridor Collective launched the largest prison hunger strike in American history. Over 29,000 inmates across the state of California refused food. 29,000. The strike reverberated through the prison system, through the state government, and into the national conversation about solitary confinement, human rights, and the limits of incarceration. The demand was clear. End indefinite solitary confinement. Replace the gang validation system, which had placed men in the SHU based largely on the word of confidential informants, with no defined end date, with a system based on actual behavior. In 2016, Todd Ashker's class action lawsuit was settled. The state of California agreed to reform its solitary confinement system entirely. The gang validation model was replaced. Thousands of inmates were reviewed for release from the SHU. A policy that had defined California's prison system for decades was fundamentally changed. The government had built the Short Corridor to control the most dangerous men in America. Instead, it handed them the conditions they needed to change American law. These 6 men are the evidence that it is more complicated than that. The streets that shaped them failed them long before any prison ever did. The system that held them could not decide whether it was punishing them or warehousing them, and the policies built to silence them became the very ground on which they found their loudest voice. Pelican Bay was built to make men disappear. Instead, it made 6 of them unforgettable. Were these men the product of a system that was broken long before they arrived? Or did the system simply have no choice? Leave your answer in the comments, because this conversation is far from over.